before coming here, I pulled out an old interview with Allen Ginsberg, who's going to be the subject of the discussion tonight, and it appeared in the Georgia Strait on July 12th, 1968. So that was in the second year of the Georgia Strait, right here. If you can see it, you've got Dan McLeod on the far right, who's the publisher and still the owner of the Georgia Strait, and two police officers harassing him, saying, "Hand over those papers or we'll get you for resisting arrest." And that actually happened to Dan because he would distribute his newspapers without a license. One of the sections, this huge interview, it's a double-page spread with Allen Ginsberg, dealt with ecology, and I'm going to quote him because it's probably of great interest to people interested in environmental issues, and Amitav Ghosh, who's specialized in that with fiction and nonfiction writing. This is what he said in the interview. Poisoning of the atmosphere, 1968, with carbon wastes causing a greenhouse effect, heating up the atmosphere, year 2000, prophesied by Science Advisory Committee as the date of an irreversible greenhouse effect, raising the temperature of the planet 5 degrees, melting polar ice caps, drowning New York. He was just getting started. We've murdered all sorts of mammal species, Ginsberg continued. And I think there are 29 varieties of birds and mammals which are doomed to extinction in the next few years unless some radical action is taken to save them. So this is said in 1968. And he was, he's on the right track, maybe missing the timing a bit on the climate change, and but also very conservative on species extinction. Because according to the World Wildlife Fund, by 2020, there will have been a 67% decline in wildlife populations on planet Earth since 1967. So this is the mind of Allen Ginsberg. He could see into the future. Some of you, those who've read Deborah Baker's book, will know that Allen Ginsberg taught poetry for 3 weeks in Vancouver, immediately after a 15-month journey across India with his partner, Peter Orlovsky, and some of the other beat poets. And that trip to India is actually an incredible tale. Probably nobody other than Deborah could have told it with such dexterity, given her deep ties to India and also living in Goa and spending a lot of time in Kolkata. So her book, A Blue Hand, the tragicomic, mind-altering odyssey of Allen Ginsberg, a holy fool, a rebel muse, Dharma bum, and his prickly bride in India, and she can explain who these characters are. It's riotously entertaining and informative, but it also provides some deep insights at a troubled time in world history. You had the China-India border skirmish, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so here's what some of the publications have said about Deborah's book. Biography which fascinatingly reads like fiction, that's from The Statesman. Deborah Baker tells the story of the beats as it should have been told, with passion and verve, the Hindustan Times. The book raises larger questions about how travel helps to define one's identity and sense of home, and that's the Library Journal. And now here's the New York Times book review. Baker's work is a piece of devoted scholarship and legwork, dunked in the screwy, hyper-intelligent, tragicomic essence of everything that drove Ginsberg to take a trip that not only changed his life, but helped spawn generations of hipsters, hippies, writers, artists, rock stars, mental cases, and self-anointed medicine men. And I might even suggest possibly the Georgia Strait. So tonight, Deborah Baker will begin by reading a passage from A Blue Hand. Then I'll ask her some questions to get things started. Then we'll take questions from you in the audience. Deborah Baker has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in biography. She's written for many publications, including the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal. She's written 4 other books, including her most recent, The Last Englishman. So, with no further ado, I'd like to encourage everyone to please give a warm Vancouver welcome to Deborah Baker.
Thank you, Charlie and Trish and Laurel and all of you guys for coming. It's really so great to be here in Vancouver. It's my first visit ever to this beautiful city. And I'll just switch here for a sec. And anyways, so I'm following in Allen Ginsberg's footsteps once again. So this book basically tells the story of Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky's journey through India. 15 months. In the beginning, they traveled with Gary Snyder.
The easiest.
And his wife, Joanne Kiger. They were both poets. They were both living in Kyoto, and they came to India and met up with Peter and Allen eventually. And they had a very different approach. They were looking for different things from India than Allen. But so it really wasn't until Allen left Gary and Joanne in Bombay and traveled across the continent to Calcutta that he really sort of began to experience India on his own terms. This is this place where he stayed with Gary Snyder and Joanne and Peter in the foothills of the Himalaya, not far from Nanda Devi, which Gary Snyder was a big mountaineer kind of person. He loved mountains and rivers, so he wanted to see Nanda Devi. So they spent some time up in the hills. But anyway, so I'm gonna read a little section from towards the end of the book when Allen and Peter arrive after 6 months in Calcutta. They've traveled to Benares. Like Venice in the off-season, Benares in winter has a magisterial indifference to those who come to walk the Ghats and contemplate eternity. Yet in Venice, the weight of one's irrelevance is lightened by this pitiless thought: the city is clearly mortal. In Benares, there is no such consolation. The sight of the faithful reenacting ancient rituals in the midst of its undying grandeur can keep a person awake at night, haunted by the rickshawala's sleepy conversations in the street below. The widow with her brass can making her mincing bow-legged way down to the Ganges was there long before Allen Ginsberg took care to describe her, and she and her like will be there long after. It is not merely that this is the most ancient, continuously lived in city in the world. It is that Benares is forever and we are not. That is the song of Benares in winter. The river plays the major chord of this lament, and in December 1962, the river was everywhere. It was in the air, mixed with the smoke of dung fires, funeral pyres, fried noodle stalls, and bidis. It was in the shapeless black woolen sweater that Ginsberg wore to keep warm. It was in the thin red towels that would never dry out, and most stubbornly, the river was in his lungs, which no cough, no matter how long or how deeply he hacked, would ever clear out. At night, he coughed. In the morning, amid the sounds of the city bestirring itself, he coughed. Every pharmacist shrugged. He was a foreigner, unused to the climate. There was nothing to be done. But it was not only Allen Ginsberg who coughed, who fought off the river fog that settles like a cat on one's chest. The arrival of the yellow fog in the early morning was greeted by a cacophony of coughs. In winter, even the Maharaja in his palace upriver coughed. Allen spent the first few days in Benares staring into the funeral pyres at Manikarnika Ghat. After Nimtala Ghat in Calcutta, he found the scene tame. In front of him lay the Ganges, and behind him were the palaces and ashrams and dharamsalas and temples stacked along the riverfront as it bent away from the train bridge to the south. The Ghats lay at the feet of these palaces, escher-like stone steps of varying widths and depths. Some were steep and some were shallow enough for even the most ancient and buckled of widows to make their way from the lanes to the river's edge to bathe and receive the Mother Ganga's blessings. Early one evening, not long after they settled in, Allen stood on the balcony that overlooked the vegetable market at the intersection leading to Dasashwamedh Ghat. His journal lay open in front of him. Peter had gone out for tandoori chicken. The desk officer at the Foreigners Registration Bureau had asked Allen, "Why does he stay so long in India?" And now, wrapped in a blanket to ward off the chill, he looked down at the evening crowds, the burping cows, and saw them as if for the first time. And what he saw were moving corpses, dead things covered in clothes, bodies destined only for the pyres. With all the gongs being run, all the cigarettes being sold, rickshaws flagged, meals cooked, clothes washed, tickets bought, it was hard to see what it all added up to beyond the tired thought that everyone, every living thing was doomed. One of the first things Allen always did upon settling in a new city was to arrange to receive his mail at the nearest post office. In his letters, he argued politics with his father, sketched his itineraries, and conducted the business of having books sent, taxes paid, and proofs corrected. In letters, too, he would give rushed, condensed summaries of his travels as if he didn't entirely trust language to carry the weight of what he had seen. But he couldn't bear being alone with it either. A description from a letter to Lucy and Carr would end up repeated in another one to Gary Snyder or Jack Kerouac. Unlike his letters, Allen's journal writing was a kind of solitary meditation. There, too, his observations tripped over one another, half undressed, too much in a hurry to do more than sketch the tableau of Daswamid Market or Manikarnika Ghat. Yet as he stood there on the balcony, lightheaded with hunger and impatient for Peter to return with his chicken, suddenly the greedy litany he'd collected seemed sleazy. He couldn't bring himself to reread any of his journals, much less mine them for poetry. In the shadows of the arcade overhang below him, the dying called out weakly. These frail shades had not yet made their way into his journal or his letters, but they hadn't escaped his eye. Having observed the dead so closely, having cataloged the raw incineration of their flesh, would he now from this perch document those death throes as well? Not long before leaving Calcutta, Allen had accepted an invitation to teach a 3-week course in Vancouver the following summer. In exchange, he would receive a plane ticket home. Like a man who, without fully awakening, sees that he is dreaming, he suddenly realized that the time he had left in India was no longer open-ended. Had he found what he had come for? He had smoked in an opium den a few times. He had shot up morphine more than a few times. And he'd abandoned his psilocybin. And what of finding a teacher whom he could love? What of getting closer to God? What of touching poverty? With the knowledge that he was running short of time came a sense of heightened urgency. He hoped that Benares would provide answers to these questions. But there was yet another lingering uncertainty. How was this all to end? Upon his awakening, would the long, winding sentence of India finish with a period, an exclamation, or a question mark? In the midst of his reflections, Allen's eye was caught by a devotee profusely garlanded with flowers, sprinting around the corner of the street below. He was carrying a brass tray of offerings and making a beeline for the Ghats. Approached by a beggar camped next to the tobacconist, the man grabbed a handful of sweets and filled the open palm before continuing merrily on his way. Allen turned to Peter, who had just returned with 2 dead birds to eat, snuck in under the nose of the landlord, a Brahmin pundit. "They're all mad," he said, finishing his thoughts, at least for the day. Thanks.
Mistake.
Actually, they told me I was going to sit there.
Do you want this?
Oh, sure. You have your own? Yeah.
Is this working? Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Deborah. Maybe I'll just start by asking how you got interested in the Beats and Allen Ginsberg in particular.
Sure. Well, I wanted to write about India in the American imagination, and I sort of started at the beginning with Thoreau's reading of the Transcendentalist reading of various Hindu Sanskrit texts, and sort of went up through Martin Luther King And then, this went on for a couple years. And then finally I came to Allen Ginsberg, and I thought, oh, duh. Because when I first moved to Calcutta, there was a lot of suspicion of Americans. Allen, when he first arrived in Calcutta, people were convinced that he was a CIA agent, which is absurd. But there's just great suspicion of any Americans coming through Calcutta. So after a while, when they realized I wasn't going away, these writers that I would meet would begin talking to me about Allen Ginsberg with great affection and warmth. And so I felt grateful in a way that he had sort of broken the ice for me in Calcutta. And I'd known that he had kept journals and written letters. And so I was eager to use him as a vehicle to explore this relationship between America and India.
It's fascinating. You also went back to the early life of Allen Ginsberg and his mother and what he went through there, and his the Howl, his famous poem. And what can you tell us about the early days of Allen Ginsberg, that kind of leading up to the trip to India?
Yeah, well, Allen Ginsberg's mother was completely mad, and his parents' marriage broke up fairly young, and he was sort of left on his own to look after his mother, who was, institutionalized many times, who underwent lobotomies, and it was really a very sad situation, but he adored her and looked after her very tenderly. She had many operations. She was covered with scars. And she was constantly taking off her clothes, and all these sort of became kind of, I think Allen really identified with her very strongly. And so in Bengal, where you have, Kali, who's a very sort of angry goddess, who's, a big, very powerful goddess. He really related to her. He really related to Krishna. So from his background, very poor, sort of, lower middle class background, he was comfortable hanging out with these, poets who were in rather desperate straits themselves. But yeah, so he went to Columbia. He had a hard time graduating. He was briefly institutionalized himself after he had this experience where he saw God, and that created this sort of spiritual hunger in him. And in those days, people didn't see God. That wasn't something that one did. You were basically diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you were treated as if this was a pathology. So he spent some months in an insane asylum, and then somehow, magically recovered. But he never got over this idea that he had to have that experience again of feeling very close to God.
And how did the Beats get together in this group of people? They're all kind of oddballs, but also very curious and challenging convention.
Yeah,
how did that come together?
He met most of them at Columbia. He met first Lucien Carr. He was this very beautiful young man who introduced him to William Burroughs. Jack Kerouac sort of came in, and all these people would become his touchstones. And a few years later, he met this other poet in the village named Gregory Corso, who was kind of this wild, manic Italian-American who had been writing poems in Bellevue, where he'd been sent, after, he was sort of a child thief. And so that sort of became the core group. There would be other people, women as well, who would sort of attach themselves to that group, but they were basically, they were his touchstones. And Allen had this idea that they were all going to go to India together. And so and a lot of his time in India is writing these letters to Jack and to Burroughs, trying to entice them to come, describing with abandon all these wonderful experiences having, all these, he met the Dalai Lama, he spent time with all these lamas who were coming out of Tibet, and, he hoped to find a teacher. And in the end, it was really, none of them came. He wrote these amazing letters.
He would write, but they wouldn't come. It looked like Gregory.
I mean, Gregory
Corso
kept
might
promising
come,
to come, but
the other, a couple that you wrote extensively about, Gary Snyder, who's from Washington State, and Joanne Kiger, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. They had a fascinating story too, and how did they end up in India with
Well, Gary was a serious student of Zen Buddhism, so he was in Kyoto to become enlightened. And he was desperate that Joanne join him from Northern California. And he said, if you come to Kyoto and study meditation and Buddhism, Zen Buddhism alongside me, you will lose your ego. And she goes like, why would I want to lose my ego? I've tried for years to have one, So, I mean, they were just sort of on two different paths. And she's sort of like, she's the prickly wife in the, she doesn't like not having showers every day. She goes to use the women's restroom, and a woman brings in the station master because she can't believe that this is a woman, So, I mean, she just, everything about India sort of and especially Allen going on and on and on about his neuroses and Howell and, his inability to sit still, to meditate. I mean, she just has no patience for any of them. And she's writing her journal, Gary's writing his, Peter's writing his, they're all sort of writing about each other. So I had this wonderful source material. I could look at, one instance through 4 different perspectives.
Well, one of the things I found amusing was how Gary Snyder was very cheap, and Allen Ginsberg would stay in the he was not riding first class on the trains. And I think when Westerners sometimes go to India, they're almost afraid to get into the third class car.
Right.
Yet he seemed to relish this.
Yeah, he was, Gary liked to go and talk to, intellectuals and writers, but Allen was so happy just to, some of his best friendships, oldest friendships, he would just people that he would meet on the train, like Jane Jewelers or Parsis, he just shopkeepers, he just had this way. He wanted, to get down, and he was just a genius traveler. And so he wasn't interested in going necessarily to museums and appreciating, this kind of art or that kind of art, or talking with the Dalai Lama about his meditation techniques. I mean, that was Gary's sort of shtick. His thing with the Dalai Lama is that he wanted him to try LSD and tell him what he thought. He thought that could be a shortcut, so you wouldn't have to meditate for hours and hours and hours. So he just had a completely different approach to India than Gary and Joanne did.
This is the thing. As I was reading the book, I felt he was so comfortable in India, almost more comfortable than he seemed like he was in America when I was reading the second. And why do you think he was just so comfortable in India?
Well, I think he really got comfortable when he got to Calcutta. I mean, and the USIS, which is the U.S. Information Service, they would try to get him to meet the sort of the hoity-toity poets and literary people, and he was really kind of bored with them because they were kind of genteel and all, they were all talking only about Tagore. But then at a certain point, he met up with this group of poets that I think reminded him of who he had been at that age, at Columbia with Jack, and they were all kind of had their own personalities. They were all came from desperate circumstances. A lot of them had emigrated from East Bengal, which was then East Pakistan. And so they were kind of not part of this, what they called the vegetarian literary crowd. Their poetry used like the language and slang of the streets and of the factories and of the rural places, and they weren't at all, and they liked to get drunk, and so Allen, and they had never talked to a white person before, and Allen not only patiently, went through Howell line by line, explaining what he was saying here and there, but he would repeat himself very slowly because they couldn't understand his New Jersey accent. They just never had that experience with a white person before. There were still a lot of snooty Brits in Calcutta at the time running the newspapers and things. So it was a very unusual experience for them.
It also seemed that he thought a lot about, like at one point, he said that he regretted that there wasn't an Indian English in India. I'm not sure whether you agree with that or not, but
yeah, he thought that Indian writing in English had no future. And these people were all writing in their mother tongue, which was Bengali, and that seemed, even though he couldn't read or understand their poetry, that seemed more authentic to him than this idea that you could have poets, like a lot of the Bombay poets were writing in English, and he had no patience for that.
Well, it was interesting too in Calcutta that he was in this world that it was so literary and so artistic and so like, what is it like when you're living in that milieu?
Well, it was different when I was there, but at that time, this is a time of Satyajit Ray's films were coming out, and whenever there was a new one, it would be like a riot. There was just so much excitement about his films. This was the time of Uday Shankar, who was a dancer who danced Indian classical dance all over the world. Ravi Shankar, his younger brother, was, and there were, so Calcutta was just teeming with these amazing talents, and including, the poets that Allen hung out with. They weren't famous at all at that time. They had their own magazine, but they would go on to be completely beloved and towering figures in Bengali literature.
What I find interesting is maybe you could answer this, is why are the Bengalis so progressive and so artistic?
It was just an incredibly rich culture. One thing that he was always disappointed by was that they weren't interested in their gods and goddesses at all. Allen was very much on a spiritual search, and he was still looking for a teacher, but he got them to go with him to the Ghats and to the burning Ghats, and he got them to translate for him whenever he tried to talk to sadhus about their beliefs and things like that. But really, they just thought it was a lark. They just thought it was,
just another Westerner.
Yeah, just a place to go get stoned and hang out and talk and watch the bodies burn.
And I have to ask you about Ashok Sarkar, who lived many years in Vancouver, moved here in 1971, but he was Allen Ginsberg's guide in Calcutta.
He was.
And so how did they come together, and why do you think they hit it off so well?
Well, Ashok made it a point he was very much connected with all the various consulates in Calcutta, and he knew whenever a foreigner showed up in the city, because he would just make a beeline for them because it was a source of income for him. And so he showed up at Allen's hotel room one day. He was staying in this really grim hotel in the Muslim part of town called the Amjadiya. And he'd created this organization. He wanted Allen to help him write a letter to Bertrand Russell, because he felt Hinduism was the secret to world peace and anti-nuclear stuff, Bertrand Russell. So, and from there, he brought Allen to like Kalighat and showed him all the places that were important for his spiritual teachings. And he introduced Allen to Nimtala. He brought Allen into the rural Bengal countryside, and introduced him to the Baal singers. There was one singing when you all walked in. There was a clip of one singing, and so I don't really go into so much in the book, his subsequent incarnation in Vancouver, but I did write it as sort of an outtake of the book. I wrote about what happened with Ashok, how he came to America, how he kept his friendship with Allen, that was a constant really till the end of Allen's life.
And they shared a birthday too.
And they shared a birthday, yeah, that's right. Which is, it was really because of Allen and his relationship with Bob Dylan and Albert Grossman that Ashok Sarkar ended up not only in America, but as Timothy Leary's guru for a while. And then finally, I think he had to get out of America quickly and snuck into Canada where he lived happily.
He was also the advertising manager at the Georgia Strait for a little while.
He is a man of many incarnations.
Very many talents. He also worked at Pacific Press, which owned the Vancouver Sun and Province in those days. And he was a magician. Dan McLeod, the publisher of the Georgia Strait, told me that he had Ashok come to his his daughter's birthday party to do magic, and he was a musician.
And he started a little Krishna worship circle here. I don't
Yeah.
know if there are any people here who were part of that, but they would sit around and sing bhajans and bring a little Krishna energy here.
You've got a scene in your book about them visiting the funeral pyres, and this was just incredible to read. So would you like to share with the audience what would happen at these events? And it's almost sacrilegious in a way, but
Well, I mean, so Allen would bring these Bengali poets, and Allen had a deep-seated fear of death, and there is a practice, a sort of tantric practice where you sit and you meditate on death in the charnel grounds. You sit among the ashes and the scattered bits of bones and drink wine out of skulls and, basically just contemplate your end there. And I think that's what he hoped to accomplish, was to, and also there were these beautiful young men sort of getting really stoned and dancing, and that was also nice for him. But so people would bring their deceased family members to the burning ghat, and they would pay the bombs, the men who oversaw the collection of firewood and saw that the bodies were turned and burned completely. They would pay them, and then they would also pay. There would be these sadhus, these sort of holy men sitting around, very, very proud, very arrogant, very powerful people, and who to say prayers for the souls of their departed relatives. And so people would sit around really for hours, all night, waiting for their mother's body to burn, and then collect the ashes and put the ashes in the river, which ran behind the burning ghat. So Allen would do this, and he would go there at night. He would go there sometimes all night, and I did it once just to see what it was like. And there was, this fierce-looking sadhu, but he would buy ganja from the sadhu, and they would smoke. And the sadhu would smoke first, and then he would pass it along to Allen and Allen's friends. And, they just sort of hung out there. And Allen would write incredibly detailed and graphic descriptions of what he was seeing. And sort of and he did the same when he went to Benares. He just sort of immersed himself in this. But after a while, it was like, he got, and that section that I read, it was like, okay, he had done the dead, but could he do the dying? And that was another sort of hurdle that he had to go through.
And how did the Indians react to his sexuality?
They're a little, it depends on who you were talking to. His friends were okay. The more Bhadralok Bengalis were completely horrified and disgusted. Allen would introduce Peter as his dear wife, and they just, and also they didn't wear underwear, they were dirty, they didn't take showers, so there was a lot of, there was a lot of,
impatience with Allen in Calcutta, but not his friends. They were like, okay. And Sunil Ganguly, who I interviewed a lot for the book, he was sort of Allen's closest friend in this group of poets. He told me later that he went to Iowa writing program and he stayed with Allen in the village for a little bit. And Allen once suggested that, they do it. And Sunil was happily married for many years. He was total heterosexual. He thought, okay, how does it work? And and Allen said, well, you have to get on the bottom. And Sunil said, nope, that's not going to happen. And so that sort of gives you an idea. They were cool with it. They were
Yeah.
interesting men.
One of the fascinating characters in your book was Hope Savage, and you told me before we came out here that there's quite a fascination on the internet about Hope Savage. So what did you learn about this woman, Hope Savage? Who was she, and how did she become such an important figure in the book?
Yeah, well, Hope Savage was, if Allen Ginsberg was looking for God in India, I was looking for Hope Savage, because she was this woman who was sort of the great love of Gregory Corso's life. And she came from South Carolina, from a fairly large, prosperous family there, and was besotted with Shelley and the Romantic poets, and could recite Alistair's 7,000 lines, from memory. She was really into Wagner. She would, she was just kind of this odd duck, and she early on ran away from South Carolina and ended up in the West Village and hung out with a lot of the same people that Jack Kerouac and Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg hung out. But she was very restless, and eventually she was really the first of that whole circle to go to India. And India and Afghanistan and Iran and Russia and Capri, and I mean, she was just this incredibly restless, but she sort of ended up in India, and Gregory Corso kept saying to Allen, well, when you're in India, try and find hope. And of course, they did end up crossing paths, and both in Bombay and in Calcutta. And Allen actually got to know her pretty well, and she was learning Urdu, and she was learning to do Indian classical dance, and she was wearing a veil, and there was just all these little bits and pieces about her in Allen's letters to Gregory. Hope's here, come to India, quick. It's like, as well as this sort of small cache of letters that I found that Hope had written to this other friend of hers. Enabled me to sort of piece together her itinerary, but I could never get a real handle on her. And I tried to track her down through her family, but nobody. She came back to America once in, I think, 1961, but that was the last time anyone in her family had seen her. And then she went back to India, where she met up with Ginsberg. But after a while, I knew that she was still alive because the family lawyer threatened me not to write about her. They were still sending checks to her, but they wouldn't tell me where she was, or if she was still in India, or if she was someplace else. But I did find this strange little collection of poetry translated from Urdu to English with her name on it. I saw a reference to it on the internet, but I was never able to find a copy. So
you mentioned she could speak Urdu, right? That she learned the language?
She was she learned Russian, she learned German. She was kind of a polymath of a kind, of a sort.
One of the interesting things in your book is that Allen Ginsberg and these other characters were in India while the border skirmish was happening with China. And what was Allen Ginsberg's thoughts about that situation?
Well, there was this war. It was really actually more than a border skirmish. It was a war between India and China, and it happened within like a week or two of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, and it was John Kenneth Galbraith was our ambassador, and it was this opportunity for India and America to, get a little closer, because India, couldn't couldn't ask help from the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union didn't want to alienate the only other communist power. So, JFK just immediately sent planes. It didn't help. They kind of lost the war, and it was kind of a shock for India. But it was very interesting for Allen because he had all these ideas about India being this incredibly religious and spiritual place, and suddenly India goes to war with China, and it becomes very jingoistic. Everyone was expected to write patriotic poems, and he was deeply horrified by this turn of events. And there was a period, this was while he was staying in Benares, where these Gandhians decided to march from Delhi to Beijing, and he and Peter accompanied them for a few days, and he hung out with a lot of these people had known Gandhi. They believed deeply in nonviolence, and they thought this was a nightmare that India and China were going to war. And I think that deeply influenced him. I mean, he'd been political before, but mostly he was into being a poet before he came to India. But, almost immediately when he returned to America, he became very involved in anti-Vietnam War, which was just beginning. He actually traveled through Vietnam on his way home, and he saw what was happening there. And, as and this idea of politics as a kind of political theater, and that he could use this notoriety that he had tried so hard to escape on behalf of, Vietnam War protests. So, the whole, levitating the Pentagon, the whole chanting of Om, the singing of bhajans, the flower power stuff, all of that political theater language came out of these months that he spent in India, and he was informed by these Gandhians. And you look at the photographs of him when he goes off to India. You can see in some of the earlier, he's very well groomed. He has a comb, he has a handkerchief. But then when he comes back, he's like a swami. He's wearing salwar kameez. He's got his Kurta. Shoulder bag and his sandals and beads and his little harmonium and his finger cymbals, and it's like this is the hippie aesthetic, he just brought it back with him. So he was sort of like the first hippie. So that was really interesting to me. That's not really what the book's about, but in terms of India's impact on the American imagination.
Historical significance of this is quite significant.
Yeah.
Interesting. So at this point, I'm going to encourage people from the audience, if you have any questions or okay, the gentleman with the beard here. Yep.
I'm wondering about, Ginsberg's immersing himself in other cultures and bringing what he learns, participating and bringing what he learns back to his own culture. And I'm wondering if, when writing about this, since there's like a conflict between seeing all cultures and religions as comparable, and there's universal ideas behind them, and then on the other side, that we have to always pay particular attention to the time and place of what's happening. And I'm wondering, so in writing about this, did you experience that tension? Because academically, it's really difficult to compare religions or cultures now.
Well, I know that I started this book after probably going to India for 10 years or so, and there was a lot about India that completely mystified me, like the whole Hindu pantheon, for one. And in reading and looking at these gods and goddesses through Ginsberg's eyes, he compared them to Walt Disney characters. And I don't know, he was a really natural teacher. So when he was trying to describe Kali would be a really good goddess for you, Bill Burroughs, because you're liking to cut things up. And and Ganesh would be good for you, Peter, because you love your sweets and your drugs. And his own relationship with Krishna was, Krishna or the Gopi girls, he had this deep experience of unrequited love. So, I mean, to see these gods and the idea of having personal gods, all of a sudden things began to fall into place. Now, that's not the same thing as, being raised with these gods and goddesses and you know, reading Sanskrit and the texts and things. But I think he really did go to the heart of as much as it was possible for a Jewish homosexual raised in New Jersey.
As a reader, I can say I came away saying I thought Deborah really knew her Hindu gods. I was quite astonished, actually, by the depth of understanding there.
And I really credit him for that
Yeah.
entirely.
Now, the question down here.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. My question is, if he was alive today, and do you think, what would he say about India? And how did he die? Because he looked very Indian when I saw his picture, but did he become Indian or did he? Thank you.
The question is, if he were alive today, what would he think of India?
Oh, he'd probably be deeply disappointed at the state of things in India right now. He did not, in the end, find a Hindu teacher. He did later in life find a Tibetan teacher. So I do think that it had a lasting impact on him, his travels, and he tried to preserve the parts that he loved. And on his deathbed, he was still reminiscing about all his friends in Calcutta.
Question here?
You were talking about Ginsberg being mainly with the Hindu gods and Hindu temples, etc. How much exposure did you have with Muslim thought and Buddhist thought and some of the other, I should say, boundary changing other religious thought?
It's a good question.
Well, he certainly studied, like when he was at Columbia, he immersed himself in all the Christian theologians. And I don't know about Islam, but, you know, he was very well-read in like the Ramayana and the Gita, and then later, you know, once he got into Tibetan Buddhism, he was, you know, basically, you know, a Tibetan. You know, he founded a Tibetan university in Boulder, Colorado. So, I mean, I think he had deep engagement with Tibetan and Buddhist thought, or Tibetan Buddhist thought. He didn't like Zen Buddhism so much. He thought that was Gary's thing. He really had a hard time sitting still. So that wasn't going to work very well for him.
But he also spent a lot of time in Muslim areas in India too, didn't he?
Yeah. He's, you know, I don't think he sort of picked up on the, you know, they thought he was Christian, you know, because he was white. All the Indians that he hung out with, they would forget that he was Jewish. So they just assumed any white person was Christian.
Okay, question here. Gentleman in the middle. Yeah. This is very interesting, Deborah.
Yeah, thank you both for this fascinating conversation. I have a two-part question. I'm curious what God meant to Ginsberg, and secondly, if Ginsberg were alive today following that question, how do you think he would agitate to protest against climate change or to shift the discourse on climate change?
I think about that a lot because I feel like so many of our means of protests have sort of lost their power, and he just seemed to be so imaginative when it came to, you know, doing a protest performance. And plus he was so famous, he could, you know, he made good copy. What was the first part of your question again? Oh, what did God? Yeah, see, that's interesting because, like, I read the letters that he wrote. I told you he had this experience where when he was still at Columbia, where he was lying on his bed reading Blake, and he heard this voice of what he assumed was God reciting Blake, and he opened this window and he saw God in the sky and in the building cornices and everything. And when he wrote about that experience at the time, because he wrote letters to, and he described it all in terms of this very Judeo-Christian type God. And, and he would quote, all these theologians. And, when he talked to his father about it, his father thought, oh my God, my son has become a Christian. That was like even more horrifying than the idea that he might have gone as mad as his mother was. But then when he sat down with the Paris Review, like in 1967, or to talk about that experience, and that's the experience that description is the one that everyone refers to when they talk about his a vision of God and his vision of what it was. It was an entirely, you could see, he described as seeing the God as a blue hand. Now, would he have described God as a blue hand if he hadn't gone to India? I think India really, changed his idea about what he saw, years, after that, the way he processed what he saw. And, he was going around and looking for gurus and so on. And one of the saints that he spoke to said, we'll take Blake as your guru. Since Blake was the one that was so tied in with this experience of God. So he did take all the wisdom of all the various sadhus and saints that he spoke with in India, and I think he internalized them, and that was the God that he ended up with, if that makes sense. No, I don't think so. I think he believed in his God, but he understood it was, that Burroughs would have a different God, and Kerouac would have the monotheistic punitive God maybe, but everyone would have their own personal God, just as they do in India, and just in Tibet too. You have these various avatars. Some of them speak to you more than others.
Okay, I'll ask a question then.
Mm-hmm.
What was the biggest challenge writing the book?
I had so much fun writing this book. I was just, first of all, I hadn't written a book in 10 years, and I was so excited to be writing again. And I loved all of these characters. I loved Peter, I loved Burroughs and Hope Savage. I thought about them, dreamt about them. There was no difficulty in it. It was, I had to try, I retraced Allen's steps. I went to his, the place where he lived in Calcutta, the place where he lived in Benares. I met the son of the landlord that he was sneaking the chicken from.
Interesting.
And it was just so much fun. I love all these places, so.
And the other thing, Burroughs was significantly older than Allen.
Yeah.
Can you talk about their relationship and how Allen viewed him
Basically,
and how it
Burroughs
evolved?
was desperately in love with Allen, and Burroughs scared Allen. He didn't really understand him. He helped him a lot. I don't think Naked Lunch would exist if it hadn't been for Allen sort of picking up the papers off the floor and putting them in some kind of order. But no, there was something very scary about Burroughs for Allen. And he felt, I think, that Burroughs would eat him up, if he let him.
And we've talked about Ginsberg and how India changed him. You've spent a lot of time in India. How has that changed you?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. It's certainly, it's not just India's changed me, but I guess Indians, listening to them talk and argue and their view of the world, I think I've internalized to some extent. At least my friends there.
Mm-hmm. The question is, why is she so interested in Indian culture, and what leads her to write books about India?
Well, I started out as a literary biographer, writing biography of American poets. I wrote 2 biographies of American poets, and after a while, you feel like everybody's been written about in America and in England, and English is my language. So, but I felt like there were all these stories Also, I got tired of biographies. I got tired of very chronological stories. I like, to, write what's now called narrative nonfiction. So, but to have characters who are interesting and and reveal something. And as I say, I wanted to write about India's relationship with America, or India's impact on American imagination, and this was my way into it. And I just feel like there are more stories that haven't been told for maybe a Western audience there. I don't know, or at least not the stories that I want to read about.
He also wrote about how he returned and visited, after the war with Bangladesh, and what happened, what transpired on that next visit?
Yeah, that's sort of the epilogue. There was this, I'm sure you know that there was this terrible hurricane typhoon that hit the coast of Bangladesh. It was probably the most, I think Amitav said was like the worst, most devastating hurricane ever in that area. And so there was this massive.
So it was a hurricane, it wasn't the war.
Well, the hurricane came first, and that was the first wave of refugees. And if you remember, the concert for Bangladesh, that was to help the refugees that Ravi Shankar and George Harrison did. And it was partly because West Pakistan's response to the suffering in the wake of this horrible storm was so bad that this war broke out. So Allen showed up in 1971, which was about a year later, when there were still massive refugees coming, this time trying to get away from the war, and all coming into Calcutta, and he wrote this poem called Jessore Road, which is the road from Bangladesh to Calcutta, and just described, the flooding, the hunger, the desperation of all these people streaming out of what was then had become Bangladesh. And luckily he taped. There's this tape of him on the road, and you hear the splashing of the waters. You hear the people begging through the car windows for money. You hear the bureaucrats saying what they're trying to do for the refugees. It's just the most shocking. I mean, to listen to the tape is really a powerful experience.
A question here?
Legacy is.
Oh, well, wait, we'll get you the microphone.
What do you think his greatest legacy is?
Well, I think it's his poems. I think he wrote at least 2 great immortal poems, if not more. I mean, there are others. He wrote a lot of bad poems, but I also feel like he was kind of, if one believes in saints, he was our saint. He was an American kind of saint. He was a saintly figure, and at first I was a little hesitant because I thought, oh well, he was gay, didn't really like women. But then I realized, no, he didn't not like women. He just wasn't really interested in women, So, so I felt like, oh, I can love this person, there was just something so endearing about him. And I loved his sense of humor. I loved his sort of neuroses. I just feel like he modeled a kind of tenderness and humility that, you don't see very often.
So what happened to him and Peter when they returned to America?
Well, they returned separately. Allen flew back to Vancouver, left Peter in Benares. Peter was learning to play the sarod, and eventually Peter made his way back to Calcutta and decided he would walk home. He would walk home. So from Calcutta, he would walk back to America, and he actually did walk. He walked through India, he walked through Pakistan, he walked through Afghanistan and Iran, and I don't really know what happened, but it was like 8 months later, actually the day before JFK was assassinated, he showed up in the village, and then they continued on as before.
Amazing. Well, with that, I think I'll wrap things up. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for the questions. They're really good.